2 days before I was supposed to walk down the aisle, my mother-in-law moved her entire life into my custom-built home without a single word of warning. She thought my silence that afternoon meant submission. She had no idea that by the next morning I would leave a single piece of paper on my imported marble kitchen island that would cost her and her son absolutely everything. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to remind entitled family members exactly who holds the power and the purse strings. My name is Kendra. I am 35 years old, and I make my living as a forensic certified public accountant and wealth manager. My entire career is built on tracking missing assets, finding hidden liabilities, and exposing financial fraud. Yet the biggest fraud of my entire life was the man I was planning to marry. It was a crisp Thursday afternoon, exactly 48 hours before my $80,000 wedding. I had just left my final bridal fitting. The custom silk gown fit flawlessly, and for a brief moment, I allowed myself to feel like a woman who had finally secured her happily ever after. I drove my luxury sedan through the wrought iron gates of my neighborhood, enjoying the quiet hum of the engine. I had spent years analyzing spreadsheets, auditing corporate accounts, and investing aggressively to purchase my $1.2 million home. I designed every square inch of it. It was my sanctuary, a testament to the fact that a black woman from a modest background could build an absolute empire with her own two hands. I pulled into the paved driveway expecting the peaceful silence of my carefully curated space. Instead, a beaten-up moving truck was parked directly on my pristine landscaping. The heavy metal ramp was dropped right onto my manicured lawn, crushing the expensive hydrangeas I had planted myself. My heart rate spiked, but I did not panic. I analyze high-pressure situations for a living. I grabbed my designer handbag and walked up the stone pathway, pushing open the custom mahogany front door. The moment I stepped into my grand foyer, the serenity of my home was completely shattered. My Brazilian cherry wood floors, the ones I had imported and paid for in cash, were covered in deep, ugly scuff marks. Spread across the entryway and bleeding into my formal living room were 15 heavily worn, poorly made imitation designer suitcases. The cheap plastic wheels of the luggage had tracked dark dirt across my white Persian rugs. The air, which usually smelled of my signature amber and vanilla reed diffusers, reeked of cheap floral perfume and the stale sweat of careless movers. I stood there taking in the devastation. I heard the thud of heavy work boots stomping on my floating glass staircase. Two men in dirty t-shirts walked past me carrying an old floral armchair that belonged in a thrift store, not a modern architectural home. I followed the sound of the commotion up the stairs, my heels clicking sharply against the glass treads. The noise was coming from my master suite. My master suite, the massive room with panoramic windows, a private terrace, and a custom-built walk-in closet that I had designed specifically for my extensive collection of tailored business suits and designer shoes. I stood in the doorway and watched in absolute disbelief. There, standing in the middle of my plush cream carpet, was Julian's mother, Loretta. She was 60 years old, but carried herself with the unearned arrogance of a monarch. She was wearing her usual bright pink tracksuit, pointing a long acrylic nail at my open closet. Carefully placed out on my bed were several of my expensive silk blouses, carelessly tossed aside to make room for her things. "Put those boxes over there," she barked at a mover, waving her hand toward the vanity I used every single morning. "And you can just sweep her little shoes into the guest room boxes. I need all this shelving for my church hats and my good bags." She did not even flinch when she saw me standing there. In fact, she smirked. A slow, calculated smirk that told me this was not a sudden emergency. This was an ambush. "Oh, good, you are home," Loretta said, her voice dripping with fake sweetness. "Julian told me you would not be back until 5. The movers were taking a bit longer than expected to clear out my apartment, but as you can see, we are getting settled just fine." The audacity of her statement hung in the air like thick, toxic smoke. Getting settled. In my home. The home I bought with my own money. The home where Julian did not even pay the water bill, let alone the mortgage. I looked at the chaotic mess of her cheap belongings infecting my carefully organized space. I did not scream. I did not throw a tantrum. In my profession, when you discover a massive discrepancy in the ledger, you do not yell at the paper. You gather your evidence, you build your case, and you execute your strategy flawlessly. Where is Julian? I asked, my voice perfectly level, betraying none of the absolute rage boiling beneath my skin. Loretta waved her hand dismissively, walking over to my ensuite bathroom and inspecting my luxury skincare products. Oh, he ran to the hardware store, she replied casually, picking up a bottle of my expensive night serum and examining the label. He needed to get some new locks for the guest bedroom doors. I have a lot of valuable things, Kendra, and with cleaners and people coming in and out, I just want to make sure my privacy is respected in my new home, her new home. The delusion was so staggering it was almost impressive. She was standing in a house I paid for, moving her things into the bedroom I slept in, casually discussing changing the locks on my interior doors. It was a power play designed to put me in my place. For years, Loretta had made little passive-aggressive comments about my career, my independence, and my money. She believed that a woman should shrink herself to make a man feel bigger. She believed that because Julian was a man, my assets should automatically become his assets, and by extension her personal retirement plan. The 15 cheap suitcases, the ruined floors, the tossed silk blouses, it was all a test. A test to see if I would bow down to the toxic family dynamics just days before legally binding myself to her son. She expected me to cry or throw a fit so she could call Julian and play the victim. She expected me to become the angry, bitter woman she always told Julian I was. I looked at her, then looked at my ruined bedroom. I took a slow, deep breath, locking my emotions away in an iron vault. The forensic accountant in me had just found the smoking gun, and I knew exactly how to balance this ledger. Before I could formulate my next response to Loretta, the heavy thud of the front door closing echoed through the grand foyer. Heavy footsteps hurried up the glass staircase. Julian appeared on the landing carrying 2 plastic shopping bags, loudly clanking with heavy brass deadbolts and doorknobs. He froze the moment his eyes met mine. The charming, confident smile he usually wore vanished instantly, replaced by a panicked, wide-eyed stare. For a split second the mask slipped, and I saw the guilty little boy hiding behind the facade of a grown man. He quickly set the bags down on the floor and walked over to me, reaching out to grab my hands. I took a deliberate step back, crossing my arms over my chest. Julian cleared his throat and gently placed his hand on my lower back, attempting to steer me out of the bedroom and into the hallway. "Baby, you are home early," he whispered, his voice dripping with that smooth, honeyed tone he always used when he knew he was dead wrong. "Let us talk out here for a second. Do not make a big deal out of this." I stood my ground in the hallway, letting him speak. I wanted to hear exactly how he planned to justify this invasion. "My mother lost her lease, Kendra," he said, keeping his voice low and pleading. "The landlord raised the rent and she could not afford it. I had to step up as her son. It is just temporary, just until she gets back on her feet and finds a new place. You know how hard it is out there right now. I need you to be a supportive Black woman and stand by me on this. We are getting married in 2 days. Family takes care of family." The sheer audacity of his words washed over me. I stared at him, dissecting every single lie. Back on her feet, I repeated, my voice cold and steady. "Julian, your mother has not maintained a steady job in almost a decade. She is not between apartments. She was evicted because she spent her rent money on designer bags and casino trips. And you expect me to believe this is temporary when she is currently directing movers to pack my shoes into boxes so she can claim my master suite." Julian shifted his weight, looking nervously back toward the bedroom. "Come on, Kendra. Do not be like that. She is an older woman. She has bad knees. She needs the ensuite bathroom. We can easily take the guest room downstairs. It is about respect. You make so much money you can easily accommodate her. You have to stop looking at everything like a transaction and start looking at it like a partnership. A partnership, I said the word, leaving a bitter taste in my mouth. A partnership implies equal contribution, Julian. So let us do a quick audit of this supposed partnership. I bought this house. My name is the only name on the deed. I paid the $250,000 down payment in cash. I pay the monthly mortgage, the property taxes, and the utility bills. I also paid every single invoice for our $80,000 wedding because your promised contribution mysteriously vanished 6 months ago. You have not put a single dime into our joint account since February. Julian's jaw tightened. His eyes darted around the hallway as his ego took a direct hit. You always do this, he hissed, stepping closer to try and intimidate me. You always throw your money in my face to emasculate me. I provide emotional security. I manage the household. You manage the household, I countered, raising an eyebrow. You just brought home new locks to put on my interior doors so your mother can lock me out of my own bedroom. Before Julian could think of a defense, Loretta's voice boomed from inside the bedroom. She did not even bother walking out into the hallway. She just shouted loud enough for her voice to bounce off the high ceilings. I can hear you out there, Kendra, she yelled. You always have to make my son feel small. That is exactly your problem. You have that bougie, independent woman attitude. You think because you sit behind a fancy desk and wear expensive suits, you do not have to respect your elders. A real woman, a traditional wife, knows that her first duty is to support her husband and his family unconditionally. You care more about this fancy wood floor than you care about your own mother-in-law. Julian looked at me silently, begging me to just let it go. Please, Kendra, he whispered. Just for a few months. Do not ruin our wedding week over this. I promise I will make it up to you. I looked at Julian, then listened to the sound of his mother dragging one of my heavy velvet chairs across the bedroom floor. For 2 years I had ignored the subtle red flags. I had excused his financial irresponsibility because he was incredibly charming and always played the role of my biggest cheerleader in public. I had convinced myself that my financial success was enough to sustain us both. I had bought into the toxic narrative that as a strong, successful Black woman, I needed to carry the financial burden to prove my loyalty to my partner. But standing in that hallway listening to the two of them demand my assets while disrespecting my very existence, the illusion shattered completely. They did not love me. They loved my credit score. They loved my income. I was not a bride to them. I was a host organism, and they were parasites settling in for the long haul. I looked Julian dead in the eye. I felt a strange, sudden calmness wash over me. It was the absolute clarity of knowing exactly what had to be done. You know what, Julian? I said, my tone softening into something that sounded almost like surrender. You are right. Family is everything. Julian let out a massive sigh of relief. His shoulders dropped and that arrogant, confident smile crept right back onto his face. He reached out and kissed my forehead. I knew you would understand, baby, he said softly. I knew my girl would come through for us. Let me go help her unpack the rest of her things. We can order some takeout tonight and just relax. He turned around and walked proudly back into my master bedroom, acting like the king of a castle he did not own. I heard him laughing with his mother, praising her for how nice her cheap things looked on my expensive furniture. I did not follow him. I did not say another word. I turned on my heel and walked down the glass staircase. My heart was not broken. It was functioning with the cold, precise rhythm of a ticking clock. They thought they had won the argument by breaking my boundaries. They had no idea they had just handed me the exact variables I needed to finalize my equation. I walked into the guest bedroom downstairs and closed the solid oak door softly behind me. I could hear the faint sound of Julian and Loretta laughing upstairs in my master's suite. The heavy thumps of their footsteps echoed through the ceiling as they continued unpacking her cheap imitation luggage onto my expensive furniture. They probably thought they had broken my spirit. They thought my silence was a form of submission and that I had simply accepted my new reality as the financial mule for their family. But in my line of work, silence is never a sign of defeat. Silence is just the sound of someone doing the math. I did not shed a single tear. I did not bury my face in a pillow and ask why this was happening to me. I walked over to the small writing desk in the corner of the room, pulled out my laptop and opened it. The screen glowed in the dark room, illuminating my face as I opened my master financial spreadsheet. I navigated directly to the folder labeled Wedding Expenses, $80,000. That was the total cost of the elaborate ceremony and reception we had planned for this coming Saturday. We had booked a 5-star luxury venue downtown. I systematically went down the list of vendors: the florist who was importing rare white orchids, the elite catering company providing the filet mignon and lobster tail dinner, the string quartet, the custom 4-tier cake, the top-tier photography and videography team. One by one, I logged into my email and began sending direct cancellation notices. Because I had paid for absolutely everything up front, and we were only 48 hours away from the event, I knew I was going to lose almost all of my deposits. The cancellation fees alone would be staggering. Most brides would be devastated by that financial loss. But I did not care. Losing those deposits was a cheap price to pay for my permanent freedom. I viewed it as an exit tax, and it was the smartest investment I had made all year. After every single vendor was canceled, I opened a blank document. I generated a clean itemized list detailing every canceled contract. I made sure to include the exact monetary losses at the bottom of the page, just so Julian could see the sheer scale of the financial destruction his arrogance had caused. I wanted him to see the exact dollar amount of the lifestyle he was throwing away. Next, I opened a legal document template. As a forensic certified public accountant who regularly deals with high net worth individuals and corporate assets, I know real estate and property law inside and out. Julian and Loretta seemed to think they had some sort of squatter's rights or an imaginary familial claim to my property just because Julian was my fiancé. But the law does not care about feelings, and it certainly does not care about a mother-in-law's bad knees. I quickly drafted a formal 30-day notice to vacate the premises. I cited myself as the sole legal property owner and listed both Julian and Loretta as unauthorized and unwelcome occupants. I used precise legal terminology to ensure there were no loopholes. I typed in the current date, printed my name at the bottom, and saved the file. I glanced at the digital clock on the nightstand. It was almost 5 in the morning. The house had finally gone completely silent. I pulled my leather weekender bag from the guest room closet. I did not pack much. I grabbed 2 of my sharpest tailored power suits, some essential luxury toiletries, a silk blouse, and my favorite pair of black designer pumps. I would not need more than that for the strategy I was about to execute. I changed into a sleek matching black loungewear set, grabbed my laptop, and slung the heavy leather bag over my shoulder. I walked out of the guest room and made my way to my custom home office to use the laser printer. The machine purred quietly in the darkness, spitting out the crisp white documents that would obliterate Julian's entire world. I took the freshly printed papers and walked into the kitchen. The moonlight spilled through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long, elegant shadows across my imported marble kitchen island. The house looked beautiful and peaceful without them awake to ruin it. I placed the documents right in the center of the kitchen island, where Julian absolutely could not miss them when he came downstairs to make his morning coffee. First, I laid down the vendor cancellation list. Second, I placed the formal 30-day eviction notice right beside it. I took a pen and signed my name at the bottom of the legal document with a smooth, confident stroke. Then I looked down at my left hand. The diamond engagement ring sparkled in the moonlight. I had actually paid to upgrade the diamond myself because the original stone he purchased was a cloudy, cheap cubic zirconia. I slid the heavy ring off my finger and set it right on top of the eviction notice, using it as a very expensive paperweight. I walked out to the garage and unlocked my luxury sedan. The crisp morning air felt incredibly refreshing against my skin. It felt like I was breathing real oxygen for the first time in 2 years. I slid into the driver's seat, pressed the ignition button, and listened to the powerful engine roar to life. I did not look back at the house as I pulled out of the driveway. I watched the heavy wrought iron gates open and close in my rearview mirror, separating me from the toxic parasites I was leaving behind. The sun was just beginning to peek over the horizon, painting the morning sky in deep, brilliant shades of purple and gold. I drove toward the city, heading straight for my favorite luxury hotel to check in and prepare for the workday. Exactly 3 hours later, as I was sitting in my hotel suite sipping room service coffee, my phone started buzzing violently on the glass table. The screen lit up, flashing Julian's name over and over again. The dominoes had officially started falling. I took a slow sip of my coffee, watching the phone vibrate against the table, and smiled. The retaliation was fully underway. By 8 o'clock that morning, I had checked out of my luxury hotel and arrived at my corner office in the financial district. I walked past the glass walls of the junior accounting pit, wearing my sharpest tailored charcoal suit and a fresh pair of black stilettos. My assistant handed me a double shot of espresso as I walked through my heavy oak doors. I sat down at my massive mahogany desk, looking out over the sprawling city skyline. The environment was quiet, structured, and entirely under my control. It was the exact opposite of the chaotic circus I had left behind in my house. I placed my phone flat on the desk. The screen was completely illuminated by a continuous stream of notifications. Julian had called exactly 47 times. There were over 80 text messages and a dozen voicemails. I took a slow sip of my hot espresso, clicked my mouse to open my dual monitors, and finally pressed play on the first voicemail. His first message was left at 6:15 in the morning. He was trying to play the role of the confused, innocent fiancé. "Kendra, baby. Pick up the phone," he said, his voice thick with sleep and fake concern. "I just came downstairs to make coffee, and your ring is sitting here on the counter. What kind of joke is this? Did you leave early for work? Call me back right now, you are scaring me." I smiled, taking another sip of coffee. He was gaslighting even to a machine. He saw the eviction notice. He saw the canceled vendor list. But his narcissism convinced him that if he played dumb, I would eventually cave and apologize. I clicked the next message, left at 6:45. The tone had shifted drastically. The fake confusion was gone, replaced by rising panic. "Kendra, what the hell did you do?" he yelled into the receiver. "I just got an email from the catering company saying our entire reception is canceled. Do you have any idea how embarrassing this is? My mother is downstairs crying in the kitchen because she thinks you hate her. You need to come back here right now and fix this. You cannot just cancel our wedding over a misunderstanding. Pick up the phone so we can talk about this like adults." Like adults. The irony of a man secretly moving his mother into my house and then begging me to act like an adult was not lost on me. I opened a new tab on my monitor, logging directly into the joint checking account we had opened specifically for wedding expenses. I did not need to talk to him. The numbers were already speaking loud and clear. I pressed play on the third voicemail, which was left just after 7:30. By this point, the panic had mutated into full-blown, entitled rage. He was no longer the charming man I had fallen in love with. He was a cornered animal, realizing his free ride was officially over. "You think you can just throw us out on the street?" he screamed, his voice cracking with desperation. "You think a stupid piece of paper is going to scare me? I have rights, Kendra. We have been living together for 2 years. I put sweat equity into that house. You cannot legally evict me or my mother. You are a cold, bitter woman. Everyone warned me about you. They said you cared more about money than your own people. You better answer this phone before I call my lawyer." I paused the audio and let out a soft laugh that echoed in my empty office. Sweat equity. Julian did not know what sweat equity meant. Julian did not even know how to use a lawnmower or change the air filters in the HVAC unit. The only sweat he ever produced in that house was when he played video games on my expensive leather sofa. No, that phrase did not come from him. That pseudo-legal jargon had the distinct, arrogant flavor of his white brother-in-law, Todd. Todd was married to Julian's spoiled younger sister, Keisha. Todd loved to walk into rooms and act like he was the smartest businessman in the world, despite the fact that every single venture he touched went completely bankrupt. If Julian was using phrases like sweat equity and threatening to call a lawyer, it meant he had already called Todd, crying for help. This was exactly what I wanted. I wanted them to collude. I wanted them to think they could outsmart a certified forensic accountant who literally catches white-collar criminals for a living. I turned my attention back to my computer screens. For the past 2 hours, I had been running a deep background trace on the missing $40,000 Julian was supposed to contribute to our wedding fund. He had claimed the money was tied up in a high-yield investment account that was taking longer than expected to mature. But numbers do not lie, and wire transfers leave digital footprints. My fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard as I pulled up the routing numbers from our joint account. I tracked the outbound transfers Julian had made 6 months ago. He had not invested the money into a high-yield account. He had wired the entire $40,000 directly into a Shell LLC registered under Todd's name. It was a failing cryptocurrency startup that Todd and Keisha had launched the previous year. Julian had literally stolen our wedding funds to bail out his white brother-in-law's terrible business decision just to buy a seat at Todd's table. He sold out his future wife to gain the approval of a man who secretly looked down on him. I hit print on the wire transfer confirmations. The heavy laser printer in the corner of my office hummed to life, spitting out page after page of undeniable proof. I organized the documents into a neat manila folder and placed it perfectly in the center of my desk. My phone buzzed again. It was a text message from Julian. It read, "I am coming to your office. We are not ending this over a piece of paper. You are not going to disrespect my family like this." I locked my phone and slid it into my desk drawer. I smoothed out the lapels of my charcoal suit and leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair. The morning after blow-up was playing out exactly according to my projections. They were angry, they were desperate, and they were coming right into my territory. I took one last sip of my espresso, feeling completely energized. Let them come. They had absolutely no idea what kind of trap they were walking into. Exactly 22 minutes later, the heavy oak doors of my corner office swung open without so much as a knock. My assistant Sandra, a sharp woman who knew better than to let unannounced visitors through, caught my eye from the hallway. She looked ready to call security, but I gave her a subtle nod to stand down. I wanted them in here. I wanted them standing right in the center of my territory so they could fully understand the power dynamic they had foolishly tried to challenge. Julian walked in first. He looked disheveled and frantic. He was sweating, and his designer shirt, the one I had bought him for his birthday, was wrinkled from the morning chaos. But it was the man walking in right behind him that truly completed the picture. Todd. Todd was a man who walked through life with the unearned confidence of someone who had never been told no. He wore a navy suit that was half a size too small and a smug expression that suggested he thought he was the smartest person in any room. He was Keisha's husband and Julian's personal idol. Todd loved to give unsolicited business advice to anyone who would listen, completely ignoring the fact that his own financial portfolio was a graveyard of failed ventures. He loved to position himself as the patriarch of Julian's family, even though he had married into it. Julian started speaking immediately, waving his hands in the air. "Kendra, this has gone far enough," he said, his voice loud and echoing off the glass walls of my office. "You are embarrassing me. You are embarrassing my mother. I brought Todd because we need to handle this professionally, and you clearly are not thinking straight right now." I did not stand up. I simply folded my hands, resting them gently on top of the manila folder I had just printed. I looked at Julian, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make him uncomfortable, and then shifted my gaze to Todd. Todd stepped forward, completely bypassing Julian, and placed his hands flat on my pristine mahogany desk. He leaned over, invading my space, trying to use his physical presence to intimidate me. "Listen, Kendra." Todd said, his tone patronizing and incredibly slow, as if he were explaining a simple concept to a child. "Julian is really upset. We all are. You are acting incredibly irrational right now, and we need to bring some logic back into this situation before you do something you cannot undo. I maintained steady eye contact and simply raised an eyebrow, inviting him to continue. He took the bait immediately. You cannot just serve a 30-day notice on a property that Julian has a vested interest in. Todd continued, puffing out his chest. I know you think because your name is on the deed you hold all the cards. But the law in this state is very clear about cohabitation and marital assets. Julian has sweat equity in that house. He has lived there for 2 years. He has contributed to the maintenance of the property. Under the doctrine of constructive possession, you are attempting an illegal eviction. Constructive possession. Sweat equity. I had to bite the inside of my cheek to keep from laughing out loud. Todd was throwing out legal buzzwords he had probably Googled in the car ride over. He was attempting to white-splain basic property law to a forensic-certified public accountant who regularly worked alongside federal commercial real estate attorneys. He was trying to use a tone of authority to mask a complete lack of factual standing. If you try to force Loretta out, Todd continued, tapping his index finger on my desk for emphasis, I will personally help Julian file a mechanic's lien against your property. We will tie that house up in probate court for years. You will not be able to sell it, you will not be able to refinance it, and your precious credit score is going to take a massive hit. So here is what is going to happen. You are going to rip up that ridiculous eviction notice, you are going to call the caterers back, and you are going to apologize to Loretta for your little temper tantrum this morning. Julian nodded vigorously, standing behind Todd like an obedient shadow. Yeah, Kendra. Julian chimed in, finding his courage now that Todd had spoken. You have to compromise. This is what marriage is about. You cannot just act like a dictator. I let another long moment of silence pass. I looked around my beautifully appointed office, at the framed degrees on my wall, at the sprawling city skyline behind me, and then back at these two absolute clowns standing in front of my desk. They were banking on the fact that I, as a black woman, would be too intimidated by Todd's aggressive legal posturing to fight back. They thought the threat of a lawsuit and the fear of public embarrassment would force me to fold and let Loretta take over my master bedroom. Todd, you mentioned sweat equity. I finally said, my voice eerily calm and completely devoid of emotion. Could you elaborate on that concept for me? Because as far as my accounting software is concerned, Julian has not paid for a single repair utility bill or mortgage payment in the last 24 months. So unless sitting on my leather sofa playing video games generates equity, I am fascinated to hear your specific legal definition. Todd smirked, standing up straight and adjusting his cheap tie. It is about the intent to marry and the lifestyle you built together, Kendra. Do not play dumb with me. You make a lot of money, and the courts will see that you are trying to financially abuse him by leaving him homeless 2 days before a wedding. You need him. You need his family. Do not let your pride ruin your life over a few suitcases. We can make this very ugly for you if you do not cooperate. They really thought they had backed me into an inescapable corner. They thought they held all the leverage because they were willing to be loud and legally threatening. I did not need to argue with Todd about property law. I did not need to raise my voice or defend my professional credentials. I slowly slid the manila folder across the smooth surface of the mahogany desk, right to the edge where Todd had been leaning. I was about to destroy his entire arrogant facade with a single piece of paper. Todd glanced down at the plain manila folder sitting inches from his hands. He let out a condescending sigh, acting as if I had just handed him a child's drawing. Go ahead, Todd, I said, gesturing toward the file. Open it. Since you are so deeply invested in Julian's financial equity, I think it is only fair that you review his ledger. Todd flipped the cover open. I watched the exact second his brain processed the bank logos and the highlighted wire transfer routing numbers. The smug, arrogant smirk vanished from his face, replaced instantly by a pale, sickly shade of panic. All the aggressive posturing completely evaporated. What is this? Todd muttered, his voice suddenly lacking all its previous volume and authority. This is a private financial audit, I replied, leaning forward and resting my elbows on the desk. You see, when my fiancé told me his $40,000 contribution for our wedding was tied up in a high-yield investment account that was taking longer than expected to mature, I believed him. But after I found his mother unpacking her discount luggage onto my imported rugs yesterday, I decided to do a little digging. Numbers. Todd are my love language. And unlike people, numbers absolutely never lie. Julian shifted uncomfortably behind Todd. Kendra, what are you showing him? Julian asked, his voice trembling slightly. He tried to step forward to look over Todd's shoulder, but Todd quickly slammed the folder shut and pressed his hand flat on top of it. He did not want Julian to see that I had the complete paper trail. But it was far too late for secrets. I will tell him exactly what you are looking at, Julian, I said, keeping my eyes locked dead on Todd. I am looking at 3 outbound wire transfers totaling exactly $40,000. They originated from our joint wedding account 6 months ago. On February 12th, $14,000. On March 1st, $16,000. On April 15th, the final $10,000. Swept clean. But they did not go into a high-yield investment portfolio. They went directly into a Shell LLC registered in Delaware under the name of your brother-in-law, a failing cryptocurrency startup that has been bleeding cash since the day it launched. The silence in my office was absolute. The only sound was the faint hum of the air conditioning. Julian looked like the floor had completely dropped out from beneath him. Todd stared at me, his jaw clenched tight, unable to formulate a single legal buzzword to save himself. I stood up slowly, smoothing out my tailored suit, and walked around the desk so there was nothing between us. You sold me out, Julian, I said, my voice low, but carrying the weight of a judge delivering a sentence. You took the money meant for our future and funneled it to Todd just to buy his validation. You wanted to sit at the big boys' table so badly. You wanted this mediocre white man to finally respect you as an equal. So you stole from the black woman who was already giving you everything. You bankrolled his terrible business decision to buy his friendship, and now you are both standing in my office trying to threaten me with a mechanic's lien. Todd took a step back, holding his hands up defensively. Now listen, Kendra, this was a legitimate business loan, he stammered, completely abandoning Julian. The market took a downturn. Julian understood the risks when he invested. I did not force him to give me that money. He offered it to help the family. Help the family? I repeated, letting a sharp laugh escape my lips. You mean help you, Todd? Because I also pulled the corporate filings for your little startup. You are drowning in debt. Your house is teetering on the edge of foreclosure. That $40,000 did not go into development or marketing. It went straight toward your personal arrears to keep the bank from seizing your property. So do not stand in my office and lecture me about sweat equity or family loyalty. You are a fraud, Todd. And Julian is just the fool who financed you. Julian looked completely broken. The betrayal was out in the open, and Todd had thrown him under the bus the second the heat was turned up. I watched the realization wash over Julian. He had sacrificed his relationship, his home, and his future just to be the savior for a brother-in-law who did not even respect him enough to defend him. But Julian was not the type of man to accept accountability. He was a covert narcissist, and when a narcissist is exposed and cornered, they do not apologize. They double down. Julian's breathing turned heavy. His hands clenched into tight fists at his sides. The guilt in his eyes vanished entirely, replaced by a dark, vindictive energy. He stepped out from behind Todd, completely ignoring his brother-in-law's betrayal. You think you are so smart, Kendra? Julian sneered, reaching into the breast pocket of his wrinkled designer shirt. You think you can just trace some bank accounts and run me out of my own home? You think you hold all the power because you have the money and the fancy title? He pulled out a folded piece of paper, his hand shaking with rage. I watched him unfold it deliberately, smoothing the creases against his leg. Todd stepped aside, watching Julian with a mixture of confusion and relief, glad that the target was no longer on his own back. You forgot one very important detail, Julian said, a sick, twisted smile spreading across his face. You might own the building, but you do not control who lives there anymore. Julian slammed the paper down on the polished mahogany wood of my desk. The sound echoed sharply against the glass walls of my office. He did not break eye contact. He stood there with his chest puffed out, breathing heavily with a triumphant smirk plastered across his face. I did not flinch or pull away. I slowly reached out and picked up the folded document. It was a standard residential lease agreement. It was the kind of generic template anyone could download off the internet for free. But this one had been meticulously filled out in black ink. I scanned the lines. The designated tenant name was clearly printed as Loretta. The lease term was explicitly marked for 12 full months starting from yesterday. The monthly rent was listed as $1. I kept reading, my eyes sliding down to the bottom of the final page where the signatures were required. On the line specifically designated for the legal property owner, where my name should have been Julian, had boldly signed his own name. Right beneath his forged signature, he had written the title Co-Owner and Property Manager. Beside his signature was the blue ink stamp of a public notary. Julian leaned over my desk, placing his hands flat on the surface to mirror Todd's earlier posture. "Go ahead and read it carefully, Kendra," he said, his voice dripping with unearned arrogance. "I went down to the city clerk's office yesterday morning while you were sitting in your fancy bridal fitting. I filed that exact document with the local housing authority. My mother is not a temporary guest. She is a legal tenant with a binding 1-year lease. Your little 30-day eviction notice is completely useless now. You cannot just throw her out on the street." Julian continued pacing in front of my desk like a brilliant defense attorney presenting his closing argument. "If you try to call the police, they will take one single look at that lease and tell you it is a civil matter. They will not touch her. It will take you a minimum of 8 to 10 months to legally evict her through the housing court system. And by the time you actually get a court date, I will have dragged your name through the mud so badly, your precious corporate clients will drop your firm. We hold all the cards now, Kendra. You need to accept that." I sat in my ergonomic leather chair holding the document in my hands. He actually thought he had outsmarted me. He thought because he spent a few hours reading internet forums about squatter rights and tenant laws, he could bypass fundamental property ownership. But Julian lacked the basic intelligence to understand what he had actually done. He did not realize that by signing a legal lease for a piece of real estate he did not own, and then filing that fraudulent document with a government agency, he had just crossed the line from a terrible partner into a documented criminal. I shifted my gaze away from Julian and looked over at Todd. For all his business failures, Todd was slimy enough to recognize when someone had crossed a highly dangerous legal boundary. Todd was staring at the lease on my desk, his face draining of all color and turning a sickly shade of gray. "Julian, you idiot," Todd muttered, taking a large step backward toward the office door. "You cannot sign a residential lease for a property you do not legally own. That is not sweat equity, that is document fraud." Julian waved his brother-in-law off, completely blinded by his own massive ego and the thrill of finally having power over me. "Shut up, Todd, you already got your bailout money," Julian snapped, turning his back on him. "I know exactly what I'm doing. I have lived in that house for 2 full years. I receive my mail there. My car is registered to that address. I have every legal right to establish a tenancy agreement for my own mother." I set the lease back down on the desk and smoothed it out perfectly flat with the palm of my hand. I looked up at Julian, studying his proud, defiant expression. I did not yell. I did not threaten to call the police right then and there. If I called the police now, they would simply write a report. I needed maximum damage. I let him completely bask in his absolute delusion. "You actually filed this with the city clerk?" I asked, keeping my voice quiet and measured. "I sure did." Julian smiled, crossing his arms tightly over his chest. "It is a matter of public record as of yesterday afternoon. So here is how this is going to work. You are going to rip up that ridiculous eviction notice right now. Then you are going to call the caterers back and reinstate our rehearsal dinner for tonight. And when you get home, you are going to apologize to my mother for your little temper tantrum. If you do not do exactly what I say, we will make your life a living hell for the next 12 months. The choice is yours, Kendra. I looked down at the forged signature on the paper. He had literally hand-delivered the exact weapon I needed to destroy him. A fake lease was a temporary nuisance, but a forged government document was a felony waiting to be prosecuted. I slowly nodded my head, playing the part of the defeated woman. "Okay, Julian," I said softly, looking back up at him. "If that is how you want to play this, we will do it your way. I will see you at the rehearsal dinner tonight." Julian smiled a wide, victorious grin, totally unaware that he had just secured his own execution. I left my office right at 5 o'clock. I did not go back to the house. I had my assistant book a luxury suite at a downtown hotel where my personal stylist was already waiting. If Julian and his family thought they were going to walk into our rehearsal dinner and find a broken, weeping woman begging for their forgiveness, they were about to be deeply disappointed. I chose an emerald green silk gown that draped perfectly across my figure. I paired it with diamond drop earrings and my highest black stilettos. I looked exactly like what I was, which was a woman who held absolute power over her own life and her own finances. The Sterling Room was the most exclusive private dining venue in the city. I had paid $15,000 in cash to reserve their grand banquet hall for the entire night. Since the deposit was completely non-refundable and the menu was already set, I decided to repurpose the evening. My family, my closest friends, and several of my top corporate colleagues were already seated at the long candlelit tables when I arrived. Soft jazz played through the hidden speakers, and the massive crystal chandeliers cast a warm, expensive glow over the room. I walked in alone, holding my head high, and took my seat at the head of the main table. My father, a retired military officer who always had a sharp eye for deception, gave me a questioning look when he noticed Julian's absence. I just offered him a reassuring smile, placed my hand over his, and told him everything was under control. Exactly 20 minutes later, the heavy oak doors of the private dining room swung open. The toxic quartet had finally arrived. Julian walked in first, looking smug and overly confident in a tailored velvet tuxedo jacket that I had paid for. Right beside him was his mother Loretta, wearing a gaudy sequin dress that completely clashed with the elegant, refined atmosphere of the room. Behind them trailed Todd and Keisha. Keisha was Julian's younger sister, the ultimate golden child who had never worked a hard day in her adult life. She was busy glaring at my guests while clinging tightly to Todd's arm. They walked into the room expecting a coronation. They thought my text message confirming the dinner meant I had fully surrendered to their fraudulent lease agreement. I watched them scan the room from my seat at the head table. Julian caught my eye and flashed a highly arrogant smirk. He actually thought he had me entirely trapped. He thought I was throwing this extravagant dinner to save face in front of my successful family, and that I would quietly pay for their expensive meals while accepting my new permanent role as their financial hostage. I did not break my polite smile. I picked up my crystal wine glass and took a slow, deliberate sip of my vintage Cabernet. I was treating this dinner exactly like a high-stakes corporate board meeting. I had home field advantage, I controlled the venue, and I was simply waiting for the opposing counsel to make their opening statement. Instead of sitting down immediately, Julian and his family began working the room. They split up, moving methodically between the tables where my relatives and friends were seated. I watched Keisha lean down and whisper something into my cousin's ear, acting overly dramatic and placing a hand over her heart. I saw Todd cornering my uncle, trying to project his usual fake business authority, while aggressively swirling his bourbon. They were planting seeds. They were laying the groundwork for a massive smear campaign right in front of my face. They wanted to make absolutely sure that when the inevitable explosion happened, my own family would view me as the irrational, angry black woman who was tearing a loving couple apart over a simple misunderstanding about living arrangements. Julian finally made his way over to the head of the table. He stood behind my chair, leaning down so only I could hear his voice over the low hum of the jazz music. "You look beautiful tonight, Kendra," he whispered, his tone dripping with fake affection and absolute condescension. "I am glad you finally came to your senses and decided to cooperate. Mom is going to say a few words to the family later to smooth everything over. Just smile and let her talk. Do not make a scene and we will not have any problems tonight." I turned my head slightly, looking up at him. I did not raise my voice. I did not show a single ounce of the disgust that was actively churning in my stomach. I simply smiled a cold, calculated smile and nodded my head. "Of course, Julian," I replied, keeping my tone perfectly measured and incredibly calm. "I want everyone in this room to hear exactly what your mother has to say. I would not dream of interrupting her big moment." Julian stood up straight, looking incredibly satisfied with his apparent victory. He took the empty seat to my right, playing the role of the perfect, loving fiancé for the captive audience. Waiters in crisp white uniforms began pouring expensive champagne and serving the first course of pan-seared scallops. The room was filled with the low hum of conversation and the clinking of fine silver against porcelain. But the atmosphere was heavy with an unspoken tension. My family could sense that something was horribly wrong. They could see the smug, entitled looks on the faces of Julian's relatives and the cold, calculating stillness in my posture. I looked across the room and watched Loretta taking her seat at the VIP table next to my mother. Loretta was already acting like the matriarch of the entire event, ordering the waitstaff around and loudly complaining about the temperature of her soup. She was completely oblivious to the fact that she was eating a $300 meal funded entirely by the woman she was actively trying to destroy. I watched her wipe her mouth with a linen napkin and gesture to Julian. They exchanged a knowing look, a silent confirmation that it was time to execute their plan. Loretta slowly pushed her chair back and stood up, tapping her silver spoon against her crystal champagne flute. The sharp ringing sound cut through the low murmur of the dining room, commanding everyone's attention. The room gradually fell silent as dozens of eyes turned toward her. I took a deep breath, keeping my hands perfectly still in my lap. The opening act of their little circus was about to begin, and I was more than ready for the show. "Thank you all so much for being here tonight," Loretta began, her voice trembling perfectly right on cue. She dabbed at the corners of her eyes with a white lace handkerchief, looking out over the sea of confused faces. "I know we are supposed to be celebrating the union of two families, but I have to be honest with you all. My heart is completely broken." A heavy silence fell over the dining room. Forks were slowly lowered to plates, and the soft jazz music suddenly felt entirely out of place. I watched my father shift uncomfortably in his chair, his military posture stiffening as he tried to read the situation. "I raised my son Julian to be a good man," Loretta continued, her voice rising in pitch to ensure maximum emotional impact. "I raised him to respect women, to work hard, and above all else to honor his family. As many of you know, I recently fell on hard times. I lost my apartment and I had nowhere to go. Like any loving son, Julian stepped up. He told me I could stay with him and his beautiful fiancée just until I got back on my feet." She paused, letting out a dramatic, rehearsed sob. Keisha reached across the table and rubbed her mother's shoulder, glaring pointedly in my direction. Todd simply swirled his bourbon, looking incredibly pleased with the performance. But instead of grace, I was met with absolute cruelty. Loretta cried, pointing a shaking finger directly at me. I thought I was gaining a daughter, but instead, I found a cold, angry woman who cares more about her expensive hardwood floors than human decency. When she saw my bags in the house, she did not offer me a glass of water or ask how I was doing. She packed her bags in the middle of the night and left us a 30-day eviction notice. She canceled the wedding vendors out of pure spite. She is trying to throw her own future husband and his elderly mother out onto the street. Gasps erupted from several tables. I could hear my aunts whispering furiously among themselves. My mother looked at me with wide, shocked eyes, silently begging me to explain what was happening. The narrative Loretta was spinning was a masterclass in manipulation. She was weaponizing my success against me, painting me as the heartless, wealthy villain, and framing her son as the tragic victim of my ruthless ambition. "Julian, you deserve so much better than this," Loretta wailed, turning to look at her son, who was now standing beside her with his head bowed, playing the role of the humiliated but loyal man. "You gave this woman your heart. You built a life with her. And the second you asked her to support you, she treated you like a bad investment. She thinks her money makes her better than us. She thinks because she has a fancy title, she does not have to answer to God or to family." The pressure in the room was immense. It felt like all the oxygen had been sucked out of the grand banquet hall. I could feel the collective gaze of 50 people burning into my skin. In the Black community, the concept of family loyalty and respecting your elders is deeply ingrained. Loretta knew exactly which buttons to push to make my own relatives turn against me. She was banking on the fact that the social pressure would force me to break. She wanted me to stand up and scream so she could point and say, "I told you she was unhinged." Or even better, she wanted me to burst into tears and publicly apologize just to make the uncomfortable staring stop. My father placed his napkin firmly on the table and started to push his chair back. He was a protective man, and he was not going to sit there and let anyone disrespect his daughter in public. I reached out under the table and placed my hand firmly on his knee. He looked at me, his jaw clenched tight with anger. I simply shook my head, giving him a look that told him to stay entirely out of it. I did not need rescuing. Julian finally spoke up, his voice thick with fake emotion. "Mom, please," he said softly, placing his arm around her shoulders. "Do not do this here. Let us just try to get through the dinner. Kendra is just stressed about the wedding. She did not mean to act like that. We are going to work it out." I watched Julian play the peacemaker, and I had to physically restrain myself from laughing. He was the architect of this entire disaster, and yet he was standing there soaking up the sympathy of the room. He looked at me across the table, his eyes locking onto mine. Behind the sad, supportive fiancé facade, I could see the absolute arrogance radiating from him. He thought he had completely destroyed my reputation. He thought he had backed me into a corner where my only option was total submission to his fraudulent lease and his toxic family. Loretta sniffled loudly, wiping her nose and looking directly at me. "Kendra, if you want to be a part of this family, you have to understand that we do not abandon each other," she declared, her voice echoing off the crystal chandeliers. "We do not throw people away over money. You need to humble yourself. You need to apologize to my son for the embarrassment you have caused him today." She sat back down heavily, clearly exhausted from her Oscar-worthy performance. Keisha handed her a fresh tissue, and Todd gave Julian a subtle nod of approval. The room was dead silent, waiting for my response. The waiters had completely stopped moving, frozen against the walls. My friends and family were staring at me, waiting to see how I would defend myself against these horrific accusations. I did not rush. I took my time. I slowly picked up my linen napkin, wiped the corner of my mouth, and placed it neatly beside my plate. I picked up my crystal wine glass and took one final sip of Cabernet, relishing the rich flavor. Then I picked up my smartphone, which had been resting face down on the table all evening. The smear campaign had reached its absolute peak, and they had dug their hole as deep as it could possibly go. It was time to bury them in it. I stood up from my chair at the head of the table. I did not rush the movement. I smoothed the silk fabric of my emerald green gown and looked directly down the length of the table at Loretta. The dining room was so quiet you could hear the ice melting in the water glasses. I did not raise my voice or show a single trace of anger. When you hold all the winning cards, you do not need to shout. "That was an incredibly moving speech, Loretta," I said, my voice projecting clearly across the room. "You hit every single emotional beat perfectly. If I did not know the actual truth, I might have shed a tear myself." My aunts exchanged nervous glances. My mother gripped the edge of the table. Julian immediately stepped forward, holding his hands up defensively. "Kendra, stop," he warned, his voice dropping into a harsh whisper. "Do not do this. You are making a fool of yourself." I ignored him entirely and kept my eyes fixed on the crowd. "As many of you know, I am a forensic accountant. I continued holding my smartphone loosely in my right hand. My entire career is dedicated to finding the truth hidden beneath layers of deception. I deal in ledgers, in bank statements, and in verifiable facts. I do not deal in emotional manipulation. And because I value security, I recently installed a state-of-the-art smart home system in my house. It regulates the temperature, it controls the lighting, and it also records crystal clear audio in every single room. I saw the exact moment the realization hit Julian. The blood drained from his face so fast he looked like he was about to pass out. He took a sudden step toward me, reaching out as if he could snatch the phone from my hand, but my father immediately stood up, blocking his path. My father did not say a word. He just crossed his arms and stared Julian down, daring him to take another step. 2 nights ago, while I was sleeping in the guest room, Julian, Loretta, and Todd had a little family meeting in my kitchen, I announced, tapping the screen of my phone. I think it is only fair that you all hear exactly what they discussed. I opened the sharing menu on my device, selected the audio file I had extracted that morning, and hit the AirDrop button, targeting every available smartphone in the vicinity. A second later, a wave of digital chimes echoed through the private dining room. Ping, ping, ping. The sound cascaded from table to table as dozens of notifications popped up simultaneously on screens across the room. Go ahead, I instructed the room, keeping my posture completely relaxed. Accept the file and press play. My cousin Marcus, a tech software engineer sitting near the front, was the first one to tap his screen. A few seconds later, the crystal clear audio from my kitchen security camera began playing. Because several other people pressed play right after him, the recording echoed throughout the banquet hall, creating a surround sound effect of absolute betrayal. The first voice on the recording belonged to Todd. He sounded panicked and aggressive. I am running out of time, Julian Todd said on the audio. The bank is moving forward with the foreclosure next month. I need that $150,000 commercial loan approved immediately. You promised me she would co-sign it. Then Julian's voice filled the room. It was not the sweet, supportive tone he used with my family. It was cold, calculating, and full of arrogance. Relax, Todd, Julian said, his voice echoing from 20 different smartphones. We are getting married on Saturday. Once that ring is on her finger and the papers are signed, her assets become marital property. I am going to tell her we need to consolidate our finances. If she refuses to sign the loan documents for your business, I will threaten to divorce her and take half the house. She cares too much about her perfect public image to endure a messy divorce right after the wedding. She will sign the papers. A collective gasp swept through the dining room. My mother covered her mouth with her hands, her eyes wide with horror. But the recording was not over yet. Then came Loretta's voice. The same woman who had just delivered a tearful sermon about family values and human decency, laughed on the recording. It was a harsh, cruel sound. She needs to learn her place anyway, Loretta said through the speakers. She has too much money and too much pride. A good wife does what her husband tells her to do. Once you get her name on that loan, she will be tied to us permanently. And if she complains, I will just keep reminding her that nobody else would want a woman with her attitude. The audio file ended. The silence that followed was absolute and suffocating. The soft jazz music had faded into the background. The waiters stood frozen near the kitchen doors. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The heavy, oppressive weight of the truth completely crushed the fake narrative Loretta had spent the last 20 minutes building. I looked at the toxic quartet. Their unified front was completely destroyed. Todd was sweating profusely, pulling at the collar of his shirt as if he were suddenly choking. Keisha was staring at her husband in genuine shock, realizing that Todd's financial situation was vastly worse than he had admitted to her. Loretta was slumped in her chair, her fake tears instantly evaporating, replaced by the wide-eyed terror of a predator caught directly in a trap. Julian was entirely speechless. His mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. He looked at my family expecting to find a sliver of sympathy, but all he found was pure, unadulterated disgust. My father was glaring at Julian with a look of lethal intensity. My uncles were shifting in their seats, their faces hardening into expressions of outright hostility. They had come to this dinner to paint me as the villain. They thought they could use my family to pressure me into financial submission. They thought my desire to keep the peace would outweigh my desire to protect myself. They had severely underestimated the black woman they were trying to con. I did not just expose a simple lie. I laid bare an orchestrated, premeditated plot to commit financial extortion, and I broadcasted it directly into the hands of everyone they wanted to impress. The courtroom of public opinion had convened, and the jury had just heard the undeniable verdict. I stood tall at the head of the table, holding my empty wine glass, feeling completely liberated. The first phase of my retaliation was complete, but they were about to realize that the punishment for their audacity was far from over. The absolute silence in the Sterling room lasted for exactly 10 seconds before the entire atmosphere shattered. My father was the first to move. He slammed his large hand down onto the heavy wooden table, causing the fine crystal glasses to violently rattle against the plates. He pushed his chair back and marched straight toward Julian. His rigid military posture and the lethal focus in his eyes made Julian physically stumble backward until his spine hit the ornate wallpaper of the dining room. "Are you out of your mind?" My father bellowed, his deep voice cutting through the elegant jazz music like a thunderclap. "You bring my daughter into this room, you sit at her table eating her food, and you actively plot to steal her assets right behind her back. You thought you could come in here and humiliate my child." "Mr. Davis." "Please," Julian stammered, holding his hands up defensively to protect his face. "That recording is taken completely out of context. We were just brainstorming financial options. It was a joke. Todd was stressed and we were just talking." "Do not insult my intelligence, boy," my father snapped, taking another step forward. "You are a parasite. You are a grown man plotting to extort a woman because you are too incompetent to build your own wealth." Around the room, my uncles and cousins were standing up, completely abandoning their expensive meals. The low murmurs turned into loud, furious shouts. My mother, who usually avoided conflict at all costs, stood up and pointed a shaking finger at Loretta. "You have some nerve, Patricia," my mother yelled. "You sat there and cried fake tears telling us Kendra was cruel while you were secretly planning to financially ruin her. You are a disgrace to motherhood." Loretta realized instantly that her emotional manipulation had completely failed. The room was turning into an angry mob, and her precious son was cornered by my towering father. She knew she had lost control of the narrative, so she deployed the ultimate toxic matriarch defense mechanism. She grabbed the collar of her sequined dress, gasped loudly, and dramatically slumped forward against the table. "Oh, my chest!" Loretta wailed, her voice trembling with exaggerated agony. "I cannot breathe. My heart is screaming hysterically." "Mom, hold on!" Keisha cried, glaring at my family. "Look what you all are doing to her. Somebody call an ambulance. She is having a heart attack. You are literally killing her, Kendra." I did not move a single muscle. I stood at the head of the table watching the terrible acting performance with clinical detachment. My cousin Alicia, who happens to be an emergency room trauma nurse, calmly walked over to the VIP table. She did not look panicked. She reached down, firmly pressed 2 fingers against Loretta's wrist, and checked her watch. "Her pulse is perfectly strong and completely regular," Alicia announced loudly, looking directly at Keisha. "Her skin is normal, and she is pulling in full breaths to scream. She is not having a heart attack. She is throwing a temper tantrum. Tell her to sit up before I pour this pitcher of ice water on her head to cure her sudden faintness." Laughter erupted from my side of the family. The sheer embarrassment of being medically called out caused Loretta to instantly recover from her fatal cardiac event. She sat up straight, glaring venomously at my cousin, but kept her mouth completely shut. The medical deflection had failed, and the reality of their public execution was setting back in. While Loretta was faking her medical emergency, the tension on the other side of the room had reached a boiling point. Todd was pacing back and forth near the entrance doors, his face flushed bright red. He was sweating heavily, pulling aggressively at his cheap tie. Keisha turned away from her mother and marched right up to Todd, shoving him hard in the chest. "What the hell is going on?" "Todd, Keisha," screamed her voice echoing off the chandeliers. "You told me the business was fine. You told me we were expanding. Are we losing our house? Did you seriously try to force my brother to steal from his fiancée to pay your debts?" Todd looked wildly around the room. He was a man who prided himself on projecting wealth and superiority, especially around Julian's family. He loved being the white savior who gave unsolicited business advice to the black relatives he secretly looked down upon. Being exposed as a broke, desperate failure in front of a room full of successful black professionals completely broke his fragile ego. He could not handle the emasculation. He completely lost his mind. Instead of shrinking away or apologizing, Todd escalated. He shoved Keisha's hands away and stomped directly toward the center of the room, pointing a shaking finger straight at me. "You think you are so incredibly smart?" Kendra Todd yelled over the chaotic shouting of my family. "You think playing a little audio clip makes you the winner here? You think you can just embarrass me and walk away? You are nothing but an arrogant, stuck-up woman who thinks her money makes her untouchable." I looked at him completely unfazed by his volume. I did not need to raise my voice. I simply let the silence of my stare absorb his erratic rage. "I did not sign any loan documents, Todd," I replied, my voice calm and razor-sharp. "So whatever pathetic scheme you three were planning in my kitchen is completely irrelevant. You have no leverage and you have no money." Todd stopped pacing. A sick, twisted smile spread across his sweating face. His eyes were wide and manic. He looked like a man who was already falling off a cliff and had decided to drag everyone else down with him. "Irrelevant." Todd laughed a harsh, hysterical sound. "You are too late, sweetheart. You spent all day running away and hiding in your corporate office while we were actually handling business. The commercial bank already approved the $150,000 loan this afternoon. The funds are already moving into escrow." The entire dining room went completely still once again. My father turned away from Julian and stared at Todd. I narrowed my eyes, processing the exact specific phrasing Todd had just used. "The bank approved the loan." "That is legally impossible, Todd," I stated firmly. "A commercial lender requires the physical or verified digital signature of the guarantor. I did not sign anything." Todd leaned forward, his face red and triumphant. He thought he had just dropped the ultimate checkmate. "The bank does not care what you think you did, Kendra," he sneered. "They only care about the paperwork. And your signature is already on the paperwork." He had done it. In a room full of 50 witnesses, including several corporate executives and my own highly connected family, Todd had just loudly confessed to forging my signature on federal bank documents to secure a six-figure commercial loan. He was so blinded by his desire to put me in my place that he failed to realize the monumental gravity of his confession. He thought he was locking me into a financial trap. He had no idea he had just handed a forensic-certified public accountant the exact unshakable proof needed to put him in a federal prison. I looked at Todd, then at Julian, and allowed a genuine cold smile to finally cross my face. It was Saturday morning, the day I was supposed to be wearing custom white silk and walking down an aisle covered in imported rose petals. Instead, I was sitting at a glass desk in my hotel suite sipping black coffee and watching a live high-definition feed from my home security system on my tablet. The aftermath of the rehearsal dinner had been spectacular. After Todd screamed his confession, I simply paid for my family's portion of the bill and walked out the front doors of the restaurant, leaving Julian and his relatives to figure out how to pay for the rest of their $300 meals. They had scattered like cockroaches when the lights turn on, but they did not run far. They ran straight back to my property. The camera positioned above my imported marble kitchen island showed a scene that was equal parts pathetic and infuriating. It was exactly 9 in the morning, and Julian, Loretta, and Todd were already uncorking a bottle of my $200 reserve Pinot Noir. Keisha was nowhere to be seen. She had likely fled to a hotel completely humiliated by her husband's public meltdown and the sudden realization that their entire financial life was built on a mountain of fraud. But Todd was still there. Despite accidentally confessing to a federal crime in front of 50 witnesses, his towering arrogance had somehow managed to completely override his basic survival instincts. He was standing in my kitchen holding court like a conquering king. Through the audio feed, I listened as Todd paced back and forth, waving a printed email confirmation in the air. He was giving Julian and Loretta a masterclass in absolute delusion. "Relax," Todd said, taking a large gulp of red wine from my crystal glass. "She is just trying to scare us. I spoke to the commercial lender this morning. The $150,000 loan is fully approved, and the wire transfer is scheduled to hit my business escrow account first thing Monday morning. Once that money clears, we hold all the leverage." Loretta was nodding enthusiastically, standing at my custom stove and carelessly scraping a metal spatula against my expensive nonstick pans as she cooked breakfast. She looked completely at home, acting as if the catastrophic public humiliation from the night before had never even happened. "You are so smart, Todd." She praised him, her voice echoing through the microphone. "I always knew Julian needed a strong man like you to guide him. That girl was getting way too big for her boots. It is a blessing from God that she canceled the wedding. Now Julian can finally take his rightful place as the head of this household and manage the finances the way a man should." Julian was sitting on one of the velvet bar stools, looking exhausted and slightly panicked, but he was nodding along with them. He had spent the early hours of the morning barricading my house. He had engaged every single deadbolt, pulled down all the motorized blackout shades, and even jammed a wooden chair under the handle of the back patio door. He actually believed that physical barriers could stop the legal consequences of his actions. He looked up at Todd with desperate eyes. "Are you absolutely sure she cannot kick us out today?" Julian asked, his voice trembling slightly. "She looked really confident when she left the restaurant last night. What if she calls the police to escort us off the property?" Todd let out a loud, condescending laugh. "Let her call the cops." Todd scoffed, leaning against the refrigerator. "I am telling you, Julian, the law in this state is on our side. You filed that residential lease agreement with the city clerk. It does not matter if the lease is fake or real at this point. By filing that document and physically occupying the space, you have established full squatters' rights. The police cannot legally remove you without a court order from a judge. By the time she manages to file an eviction lawsuit, we will have the loan money in hand. We will hire a ruthless defense attorney and drag her through civil litigation for years. She will bleed so much money in legal fees that she will eventually beg us to settle. We just have to hold down the fort." They were drinking my wine, eating my food, and plotting to use money stolen in my name to fight me in court. They thought they had found the ultimate loophole. They believed that because they were inside the house and the doors were locked, they had won the standoff. They thought I was sitting in my hotel room crying over my ruined wedding day, paralyzed by the sheer audacity of their plan. I reached out and tapped the screen of my tablet, closing the security feed. I did not need to see anymore. Let them drink the wine. Let them celebrate their imaginary victory. It would be the last moment of peace any of them experienced for a very long time. I stood up from the glass desk and walked into the hotel bathroom. I looked at my reflection in the wide mirror. There were no dark circles under my eyes. There were no tear stains on my cheeks. I felt a deep, powerful surge of adrenaline coursing through my veins. The woman looking back at me was not a heartbroken bride. She was an apex predator who had just finished laying the perfect trap. I opened my heavy garment bag and bypassed the soft, comfortable clothes. I reached for my sharpest navy blue tailored power suit. I paired it with a crisp white silk blouse and my most intimidating black stilettos. I applied a bold red lip, deliberately painting on my war paint. Today was not a day for mourning a relationship that was built on lies. Today was a day for absolute asset recovery and federal prosecution. I walked back into the main room and checked my luxury watch. It was exactly 9:30. I had spent the entire night awake, not crying but organizing. I had compiled every single wire transfer log, every IP address ping from Todd's fraudulent digital signature, and every second of audio from my security cameras into a flawless master dossier. I slid the thick binder into my leather briefcase and snapped the brass locks shut. My contact at the Financial Crimes Division had been incredibly responsive when I called him at 6 in the morning with hard evidence of interstate wire fraud. He had promised to meet me at the property right at 10 o'clock sharp. I grabbed my car keys and walked out of the hotel suite, my heels clicking rhythmically against the marble floor of the hallway. Julian, Loretta, and Todd thought they had successfully barricaded themselves inside an impenetrable fortress. They had absolutely no idea that they had just voluntarily locked themselves inside a federal crime scene. I pulled my luxury sedan onto the quiet tree-lined street of my neighborhood. It was exactly 9:55 in the morning. The sun was shining brightly, and the manicured lawns of my neighbors looked perfectly pristine. Under normal circumstances, I would have been sitting in the bridal suite of a luxury hotel, surrounded by makeup artists and photographers preparing to walk down the aisle. But there was nothing normal about the parasites occupying my property. I drove past my house, completely ignoring the beaten-up moving truck still parked illegally on the grass, and pulled over half a block down the street. A sleek black unmarked SUV and a standard local police cruiser were already parked against the curb waiting for me. I stepped out of my car, adjusting the lapels of my tailored navy blue suit. The morning breeze was cool, but I felt completely on fire. A tall, sharp-looking man wearing a dark suit and a federal badge clipped to his belt stepped out of the SUV. This was Agent Carter, a senior investigator with the Financial Crimes Division. I had worked with him multiple times in the past when my corporate audits uncovered massive embezzlement schemes. He knew my work was flawless, and when I called him at 6 in the morning with an airtight claim of interstate wire fraud, he did not hesitate to mobilize. Two uniformed local police officers stepped out of their cruiser and joined us on the sidewalk. "Good morning, Kendra," Agent Carter said, shaking my hand firmly. "I reviewed the digital files you sent over on my secure drive, but I need the physical copies before we go in there." I popped the brass locks on my leather briefcase and handed him the thick, organized binder. "Everything is in there," I said, my voice steady and professional. "You have the routing numbers, the originating IP addresses that match my home internet network, and the time-stamped audio recording of the suspect admitting to forging my signature on a commercial loan application. The total amount is $150,000, crossing state lines, making it a federal offense." Agent Carter flipped through the first few pages of the dossier. He let out a low whistle, shaking his head. "You tied a perfect bow on this one, Kendra," he muttered, closing the binder and tucking it under his arm. "This is textbook wire fraud. The local boys are here to keep the peace and handle the trespassing elements, but the white-collar division is taking the lead on the brother-in-law. Let us go crash a wedding day." We walked down the sidewalk in a tight professional formation. The clicking of my stilettos synchronized perfectly with the heavy thud of the officers' work boots. A few of my neighbors were standing on their porches watering their plants and staring with wide eyes as I marched up my own driveway flanked by law enforcement. I did not look at them. My eyes were locked dead on the custom mahogany front door of my house. Julian had spent his morning running around locking every single deadbolt and barricading the doors, thinking he was a tactical genius. He completely forgot that when I designed and built this house, I installed a highly advanced smart security system. The physical deadbolts were connected to a central digital mainframe. He could turn the brass knobs all he wanted on the inside, but I held the master administrator privileges on the outside. I walked up the stone pathway, stepped onto the front porch, and pulled out my smartphone. I opened the security application, bypassed the standard entry screen, and entered my master override code. A loud mechanical click echoed through the heavy wood as all three deadbolts automatically snapped back into their unlocked positions. I reached out, grabbed the polished metal handle, and pushed the door wide open. The immediate smell of frying bacon and expensive espresso hit my nose. They were completely relaxed, They were enjoying a luxurious Saturday morning brunch in a house they were actively trying to steal. The sound of their voices drifted down the hallway from the kitchen. I could hear Loretta loudly laughing at a joke and Todd boasting about how easily he manipulated the commercial banking system. I stepped into the grand foyer, leaving the front door wide open behind me. Agent Carter stepped in right beside me, and the two uniformed officers flanked us, resting their hands casually on their duty belts. We moved silently down the hallway. The thick imported rugs absorbed the sound of our footsteps. They had no warning. They had absolutely no idea the walls of their little fortress were already collapsing. I turned the corner and stepped directly into the massive, open-concept kitchen. The visual was like a Renaissance painting of absolute entitlement. Loretta was standing at my custom gas stove, wearing one of my expensive silk robes that she had clearly dug out of my closet. She was flipping pancakes with a metal spatula. Julian was sitting on a velvet bar stool, leaning back with his feet kicked up on my marble island, holding a mug of my imported coffee. Todd was standing by the refrigerator holding a crystal glass filled to the brim with my reserve Pinot Noir, looking incredibly smug as he lectured Julian about real estate law. I stood in the entryway of the kitchen, crossing my arms over my chest. I did not say a word. I just waited for them to notice the change in the atmosphere. Todd was the first one to turn his head. He was mid-sentence explaining how the eviction process would take months when his eyes locked onto mine. His mouth stopped moving, but his jaw just hung open. The smug, arrogant expression completely melted off his face, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated terror. He looked past my tailored suit and saw the two uniformed police officers blocking the hallway. Then he saw Agent Carter standing directly next to me holding the thick binder of evidence. The crystal wine glass slipped right out of Todd's hand. It shattered against my hardwood floor, sending dark red wine splattering across the polished wood and the white baseboards. The sharp sound of the breaking glass made Julian flinch. He spun around on his bar stool, his eyes going wide. Loretta gasped, dropping her spatula onto the hot stove. She clutched the collar of my silk robe, stepping back until her back hit the tiled backsplash. Nobody moved. The sizzling sound of bacon grease popping in the pan was the only noise in the entire house. Julian looked at me, and then looked at the badges gleaming on the chests of the men standing beside me. His squatter fantasy evaporated in less than 3 seconds. He tried to speak, but his throat was completely dry. "What is the matter, Julian?" I finally said, breaking the heavy silence. My voice was calm, cold, and completely dominant. "You look surprised to see me. Did you really think you could lock the door of my own house and I would just sit in a hotel room and cry about it?" Julian stammered slowly, lowering his feet from the marble island. "You cannot bring the police here. I filed a lease. We have legal rights to be in this property. You are violating our tenant rights." He looked at the local police officers, desperately hoping they would agree with his internet law degree. He thought this was a simple domestic dispute over an eviction notice. He had absolutely no idea why Agent Carter was really there. Agent Carter stepped forward, pulling his federal badge from his belt and holding it up for everyone in the room to see clearly. "Tenant rights are a matter for the civil housing courts," Agent Carter said, his voice deep and authoritative. "We are not here about a lease agreement. We are here about a forged signature on a federal commercial bank loan." Todd's knees actually buckled. He grabbed the edge of the kitchen counter to keep himself from collapsing onto the floor. The color completely drained from his face, leaving him looking like a ghost. The barricades had failed. The fake lease was useless. The feds had arrived and the total destruction of their family had officially begun. Todd opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked wildly between Agent Carter, the two local police officers, and me. The extreme arrogance that had defined his entire existence was completely gone, replaced by the frantic, darting eyes of a cornered rat. He let go of the kitchen counter and took a shaky step backward, his expensive leather shoes crunching on the broken glass of the wine he had just dropped. "This is a massive misunderstanding," Todd finally choked out, his voice cracking. He raised his hands in a placating gesture. There is no wire fraud here. We are family. This was an internal family financial arrangement. Kendra is just upset about a personal disagreement, and she is blowing this completely out of proportion. I walked over to the marble kitchen island, stepping carefully over the spilled Pinot Noir. I did not raise my voice. I did not need to. I held absolute power in the room, and everyone felt it. Agent Carter stepped up beside me and placed the heavy evidence binder directly onto the pristine countertop. I flipped it open to the first tab. "There is no misunderstanding, Todd," I said, keeping my tone perfectly level and strictly professional. "You see, when you try to white-splain business to a forensic-certified public accountant, you should probably make sure you actually know how the digital banking system works. You thought you were brilliant. You thought because you used an online document signing service, you could just type my name, hit submit, and walk away with a six-figure bailout." Todd swallowed hard. Sweat was beading on his forehead, and his cheap navy suit suddenly looked suffocating. Julian was staring at Todd, his eyes wide with horror, slowly realizing that the brother-in-law he idolized had just dragged him into a massive federal investigation. "Let us review the timeline, Todd." I continued, tapping my manicured fingernail against the top document in the binder. "Yesterday afternoon at exactly 2:15, while Julian was in my office threatening me with a fake residential lease, you were busy on your laptop. You accessed a commercial lending portal. You submitted a final application for a $150,000 business line of credit for your failing cryptocurrency LLC. And on the line requiring the signature of the primary financial guarantor, you applied an electronic signature with my full legal name." "That is a lie." Todd stammered, his face turning a sickly shade of gray. "You cannot prove I typed that. Julian had access to those files. Julian said you verbally agreed to co-sign the loan." Julian violently recoiled, as if Todd had just struck him. "I never said that," Julian shouted, his voice echoing in the kitchen. "Do not try to pin this on me, Todd. I told you to wait until after the wedding. I never told you to forge her name." Agent Carter held up a hand, silencing Julian immediately. The investigator looked at Todd with an expression of pure professional disgust. "We do not need his testimony to prove you did it, Todd," Agent Carter said, his deep voice cutting through the panic. "Ms. Davis is one of the best forensic auditors in this state. She did not just find the forged application, she pulled the digital metadata." I turned the page in the binder, revealing a printed spreadsheet highlighted in bright yellow. Every electronic signature logs a unique IP address, verifying the exact network location of the device used to sign the document. I explained, looking dead into Todd's panicked eyes. "I ran a trace on the IP address attached to the forged signature. It did not match the secure network at my corporate accounting firm. It did not match the cellular data from my smartphone. The IP address logged at 2:15 yesterday afternoon traces directly back to the residential internet router registered in your name at your home address across the state line." Todd's chest began to heave. He was hyperventilating. The walls of his delusion were completely crashing down around him. He had convinced himself that because he was a confident white man in a tailored suit, the system would naturally protect him. He never expected a black woman to meticulously dismantle his entire life with a stack of printer paper. And because you were sitting in your home across the state line when you fraudulently transmitted that application to a commercial bank headquartered in this state, I continued, you triggered a specific set of jurisdictional laws. You crossed state lines using electronic communications to commit financial fraud. That falls under Title 18 United States Code Section 1343. Agent Carter chimed in smoothly, quoting the exact federal statute. "Interstate wire fraud. It carries a maximum penalty of 20 years in a federal penitentiary." Todd let out a pathetic whimpering sound. He looked at Loretta, who was still pressed against the kitchen backsplash, clutching my silk robe. Loretta was absolutely silent. The woman who always had a loud, arrogant opinion about everything was completely paralyzed. She was watching the man she praised as the perfect role model completely disintegrate in front of law enforcement. But I was not finished yet. I turned to the final page in the binder. Todd was banking on the fact that he had actually secured the money. He thought if he had the cash, he could hire a defense attorney and fight his way out. "You told Julian this morning that the bank approved the loan," I said, my voice turning icy. "You told him the wire transfer was scheduled to hit your business escrow account first thing Monday morning. You thought you beat me to the punch." Todd looked up, a tiny glimmer of desperate hope flickering in his eyes. "The bank did approve it," he whispered. "The funds are already in transit." I smiled. It was a cold, calculating smile that contained absolutely no warmth. "They were in transit, Todd," I corrected him. "But as a licensed wealth manager, I have direct administrative contacts at every major commercial lender in this region. I called the vice president of fraud operations at your bank at 6 o'clock this morning. I provided them with this exact binder of evidence." Todd's eyes widened in absolute horror. "The bank immediately froze the transfer," I stated, watching his soul completely leave his body. "They flagged your LLC for fraudulent activity. They locked all of your existing accounts. You are not getting a single dime of that $150,000. In fact, the commercial bank is now acting as the primary victim of the fraud, and they are fully cooperating with the federal investigation against you. You are completely bankrupt, Todd, and you are going to prison." The silence that followed was deafening. The sheer magnitude of the destruction I had just unleashed upon him hung heavy in the air. Todd had tried to steal my wealth to save his own sinking ship. Instead, he had handed me the exact coordinates to blow his ship completely out of the water. He had no money. He had no leverage. He had no defense. Todd slowly slid down the front of the stainless steel refrigerator, his legs completely giving out beneath him. He sat on my hardwood floor, surrounded by the shattered glass of the wine he had been drinking just 5 minutes earlier, and buried his face in his hands. He began to sob loudly right there in my kitchen. It was the ugly, pathetic crying of a man who realized he had just destroyed his own life, because his ego could not handle being outperformed by a woman he viewed as inferior. Agent Carter looked down at Todd and shook his head. He reached to the back of his belt and pulled out a pair of heavy steel handcuffs. The metallic clicking sound echoed sharply in the quiet kitchen, signaling the official end of Todd's reign of arrogance. The ultimate professional takedown was complete, and the toxic family that had relied on him was about to completely implode. Agent Carter stepped around the marble kitchen island, his shoes crunching softly on the broken glass. Todd did not put up a fight. He simply held his hands out in front of him, completely broken. The heavy steel handcuffs clicked loudly into place, echoing off the high ceilings of my custom kitchen. "You have the right to remain silent." Agent Carter recited, his voice a low, steady rumble as he hauled Todd up from the floor. "I highly suggest you use it." Just as Agent Carter was reciting the Miranda rights, the sound of tires screeching violently against the asphalt echoed through the open front door. A car door slammed hard. Rapid, frantic footsteps pounded up the stone pathway and across the front porch. Keisha burst into the grand foyer, clutching her designer handbag and staring at her smartphone with absolute panic in her eyes. "Todd, what is going on?" Keisha screamed, storming down the hallway before she even realized who else was in the room. "I just tried to buy a coffee and my debit card declined. The teller told me every single one of our bank accounts is frozen for suspected fraudulent activity." She rounded the corner into the kitchen and stopped dead in her tracks. Her eyes darted from me standing in my tailored power suit to the two local police officers and finally landed on her husband. Todd was standing in the center of the kitchen, with his hands cuffed behind his back, tears streaming down his flushed face. The toxic family loyalty that had bound them together for decades instantly evaporated. Keisha did not run to comfort her husband. She did not ask the officers what the charges were. She instantly spun around and directed all of her hysterical rage right at Julian. "You did this," Keisha shrieked, pointing a shaking finger at her brother. "You dragged my husband into your pathetic financial mess. You told us Kendra was going to pay off the business debt. You told Todd to handle the paperwork because you were too much of a coward to ask her yourself. You ruined his life." Julian pressed his back hard against the kitchen counter, looking like a trapped animal. the golden child facade completely shattered. He was terrified that Keisha's screaming was going to make Agent Carter put handcuffs on him next. When a covert narcissist is backed into a corner, they will sacrifice absolutely anyone to save their own skin. Julian did not hesitate for a single second. "Do not put this on me," Julian yelled, his voice cracking in a high pitch of sheer panic. "I did not forge anything. I did not sign those bank documents. It was Mom's idea." Loretta gasped, pressing her hands against her chest as if she had just been physically shot. "Julian, do not you dare," she warned, her voice trembling with sudden terror. "I am not going down for this." Julian continued, pointing directly at his mother. "You are the one who told Todd to submit the application yesterday. You are the one who told me to file that fake lease at the city clerk so we could hold the house hostage. You said Kendra had too much pride to fight us publicly. You told Todd to just use her name because you said she was too stupid to check the IP addresses." The ultimate betrayal was completely laid bare. The son she had worshipped, the son she had defended and manipulated me for, was now aggressively throwing her directly under the tires of a federal investigation just to deflect the heat from himself. Loretta looked at Julian with an expression of pure horror, finally realizing that the selfish, entitled monster she had raised had zero loyalty, even to his own mother. Keisha lunged forward, swinging her expensive handbag at Julian. "You are a disgusting liar!" Keisha screamed, her voice echoing wildly. "You let my husband take the fall for your scam." The two local police officers immediately stepped forward, separating the siblings before the altercation could turn physical. One officer grabbed Keisha by the arm, pulling her back, while the other pointed a stern finger at Julian, warning him to stay exactly where he was. The beautiful unified family front that had sat at my rehearsal dinner the night before, acting like they owned the world, was now tearing each other to absolute shreds right in the middle of my kitchen. Loretta realized that her own children were completely useless to her now. She saw Todd being escorted toward the front door by Agent Carter. She looked around the room and her eyes finally landed on me. The woman who had spent 2 years insulting my career, mocking my independence, and trying to steal my home, suddenly dropped all her false pride. Loretta took a step toward me and collapsed heavily onto her knees right on my imported hardwood floor. She clasped her hands together, tears pouring down her wrinkled face. It was not the fake theatrical crying from the restaurant. This was the raw, ugly weeping of a woman who knew her entire life was completely over. "Kendra, please," Loretta begged, her voice a desperate, pathetic wail. "Please, you have to stop this. You are a woman of God. You know we are family. Todd made a terrible mistake, but he has children to feed. Julian is just confused. I am an old woman, Kendra. You cannot send the police after us. Please, I am begging you, have mercy on us. Drop the charges. I will pack my bags right now. We will leave and you will never see us again. Just tell the investigator it was a misunderstanding." I looked down at her, kneeling at my feet, wearing my stolen silk robe, surrounded by the chaos she had actively orchestrated. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. "Get up, Loretta," I said, my voice ice cold and completely void of emotion. "Do not insult my intelligence by begging for a mercy you never intended to show me. You did not make a mistake. A mistake is forgetting to pay a utility bill. You orchestrated a calculated, premeditated attack on my livelihood, my property, and my future. You tried to use my success to fund your son's laziness, and you tried to destroy my reputation when I refused to comply." Loretta sobbed louder, reaching out to grab the hem of my tailored suit pants. I took a sharp step back, refusing to let her touch me. Furthermore, I continued, looking between Loretta and Julian. "I do not control the federal government. I cannot drop the charges even if I wanted to. You stole from a commercial bank, Loretta. The bank is the victim of the wire fraud. They are pressing the federal charges. All I did was hand them the receipts. So you can pack your cheap suitcases and leave my house today, but you are not walking away from this. You are going to spend the next several months answering to federal prosecutors." Loretta buried her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably into the floorboards. Julian stood frozen in the corner, completely silent, realizing for the first time in his life that there was no one left to bail him out. The implosion was absolute. They had set the fire hoping to burn me alive, and instead, they had completely incinerated themselves. Agent Carter placed a firm hand on Todd's shoulder and guided him out of the kitchen. The loud clanking of the steel handcuffs against Todd's belt buckle was the only sound he made as he was marched down the hallway. Keisha, completely unhinged by the sudden destruction of her comfortable lifestyle, sprinted after them. She was screaming wildly at the federal agent, demanding to know how she was supposed to pay her credit card bills if their accounts were frozen. One of the local police officers gently but firmly escorted her out the front door, closing it halfway to give us a sliver of privacy. The heavy silence returned to the kitchen. The air no longer smelled of expensive espresso and frying bacon. It smelled of spilled wine and absolute defeat. Loretta was still on the floor, quietly sobbing into the silk fabric of my robe. Julian was standing near the refrigerator, his chest heaving as he stared down the empty hallway. He had just watched his brother-in-law get hauled away to face 20 years in a federal penitentiary. He had watched his sister lose her entire financial safety net. He was standing in the wreckage of a life he had completely destroyed. But a covert narcissist never truly accepts defeat. When their grand illusions of power are shattered, they frantically search the debris for any remaining weapon they can use to regain control. I watched Julian slowly turn his head. His eyes darted around the kitchen, looking for an escape route or a loophole. His gaze finally landed on the center of the imported marble island. Sitting right next to the broken glass of the Pinot Noir was the single piece of paper I had left for him 2 mornings ago, the formal 30-day eviction notice. I saw the exact moment a desperate, toxic idea formed in his mind. Julian wiped the sweat from his forehead and took a deep breath. He stood up straight, trying to physically inflate himself to appear intimidating again. He walked over to the kitchen island, his shoes crunching over the glass, and snatched the piece of paper off the counter. He held it up, gripping it so tightly his knuckles turned white. "You think you have won, Kendra?" Julian said, his voice shaking violently but attempting to sound authoritative. "You think because you brought the feds here for Todd, you can just snap your fingers and make me disappear?" Well, Todd was an idiot. Todd got sloppy. But I did not commit wire fraud. I did not cross state lines. I am still standing here and I still have rights. He pointed a trembling finger directly at the paper in his hand. "This is a legally binding document." Julian sneered, his upper lip curling into a desperate snarl. "You drafted it yourself. You signed it yourself. The notice explicitly says 30 days, Kendra. 30 days to vacate the premises. You served it to me on Thursday morning. That means my mother and I have 28 days left. You cannot legally make us move our bags today. We are not going anywhere." Loretta, hearing her son suddenly find his courage, slowly stopped crying. She sniffled loudly, wiping her wet face with the back of her hand. She awkwardly pushed herself up from the floor, leaning heavily against the stainless steel dishwasher. She looked at Julian holding the eviction notice, and a tiny spark of her old, arrogant entitlement flickered back to life in her eyes. "He is right, Kendra." Loretta croaked, her voice raspy from sobbing. "You gave us 30 days. That is the law. You cannot just throw an old woman out onto the street without proper notice. We are staying right here until the end of the month. You are going to have to look at us every single day." Julian nodded aggressively, feeling emboldened by his mother's sudden support. "That is right," Julian spat, taking a step toward me. "We are staying. And since you completely humiliated me in front of my family last night and ruined my wedding day, I am going to make these next 28 days a living hell for you. I will legally occupy this house until the very last second. You will have to go through the actual courts to physically remove me, and I will drag it out for months. I will make sure this house is a nightmare for you." I stood in my tailored navy suit, completely unbothered by his little speech. I looked at the piece of paper trembling in his hand. It was genuinely fascinating to watch a man who had spent the last 48 hours completely disregarding the law suddenly try to use it as a shield. He was clinging to that eviction notice, like a life raft in the middle of a hurricane, completely unaware that the water beneath him was already boiling. I did not interrupt him. I let him lay out his entire pathetic threat. I let him paint the picture of how he was going to terrorize me in my own home for the next month. When he finally finished speaking, he stood there panting, waiting for me to react. He wanted me to argue with him about tenant laws. He wanted me to show frustration. Instead, I let out a soft, genuine laugh. The sound echoed brightly in the tense kitchen, confusing him entirely. "Julian, you really need to start reading the fine print before you build a strategy," I said, my voice incredibly calm and conversational. I reached down and picked up my leather briefcase, placing it on the clean side of the marble island. I clicked the brass locks open. "You are absolutely right about one thing, Julian." I continued, reaching inside the briefcase. "The document you are holding is a residential eviction notice. And under normal circumstances, a residential tenant does legally receive 30 days to vacate a property. That is standard housing protocol." I pulled out a thick, stapled packet of legal documents printed on heavy blue corporate bonded paper. I held it up, letting the morning sunlight catch the raised gold seal of a commercial notary public on the front page. "But there is a massive fundamental flaw in your little squatter's rights fantasy," I said, holding his gaze. "You are assuming that this property is still a residential home. You are assuming that I am still your landlord." Julian's arrogant smirk began to fade. He looked at the blue legal packet in my hand and then back down at the piece of plain printer paper he was holding. The desperate confidence he had just managed to scrape together began to instantly evaporate. "What are you talking about?" Julian whispered, his voice dropping to a panicked rasp. I smiled, stepping forward and placing the heavy blue packet directly on top of the marble island right in front of him. I was about to drop the final devastating anvil on his entire existence. I reached across the marble island and tapped my index finger against the heavy blue cover of the legal packet. Julian stared at it, his chest rising and falling rapidly. He did not want to open it. He knew that whatever was inside that folder was going to completely obliterate his final pathetic attempt at maintaining control. "Go ahead, Julian," I instructed, keeping my voice perfectly steady. "Open it and read the first page." He slowly reached out with trembling hands and flipped open the heavy cover. I watched his eyes scan the dense legal text. His lips moved slightly as he silently read the header. "A deed of absolute corporate transfer." "I did not evict you, Julian," I said, stepping back from the island and folding my arms. "I sold the house." Julian snapped his head up, looking at me as if I had just spoken a foreign language. "You cannot sell the house," he stammered, his voice pitching upward in panic. "We live here. You gave me 30 days. I filed a lease. You cannot just sell it out from under us." "I can, and I did," I replied smoothly. "You see, Julian, when you play checkers, you focus on the piece directly in front of you. When I play chess, I am looking at the entire board. Because I manage high-net-worth real estate portfolios for my corporate clients, I actively monitor city zoning changes. 3 months ago, the Municipal Planning Committee quietly rezoned the southern border of this neighborhood to allow for high-density commercial development. For the past 6 weeks, a major commercial real estate conglomerate has been sending me highly lucrative buyout offers for this specific lot. I ignored them at first because I loved this house and I thought I was going to build a family here. But after I walked in and saw your mother unpacking her cheap bags into my master suite, I picked up the phone and called the developer back." Loretta let out a loud gasp from her spot near the dishwasher. She clutched the silk fabric of my robe tighter around her body, finally realizing the sheer magnitude of the mistake she had made. "You sold your own home just to get rid of us," Loretta whispered, her eyes wide with disbelief. "I did not sell it just to get rid of you, Loretta," I corrected her, turning my gaze to meet hers. "I sold it because it was a brilliant financial maneuver. The developer wanted this land badly enough to pay double the current market value. I executed a rapid cash for keys corporate buyout. The wire transfer for $2.4 million cleared my private accounts at exactly 8 o'clock yesterday morning. The 30-day eviction notice I left on the counter was just a decoy. It was a piece of cheese in a mousetrap designed to keep Julian occupied while the final corporate deed was registered with the city. Julian shook his head violently, stepping backward. "It does not matter," he shouted, waving the plain printer paper in the air. "The lease I filed is still valid. The new owners have to honor the existing residential lease. You are just trying to scare us. We are not leaving." Before I could explain the fundamental flaw in his internet law degree, a deep, powerful vibration shook the floorboards beneath our feet. The low, heavy rumble of massive diesel engines echoed through the quiet suburban neighborhood. The crystal light fixtures hanging over the kitchen island began to rattle softly. Julian froze. He dropped the paper and ran toward the large front windows in the living room. I followed him at a calm, leisurely pace. Through the expensive glass, we watched a convoy of massive industrial vehicles turn into my driveway. Two large yellow excavators rolled off a flatbed trailer, crushing my manicured lawn and completely blocking the beaten-up moving truck Julian had rented. Right behind the heavy machinery, 3 black luxury sport utility vehicles parked along the curb. 4 men wearing tactical black uniforms with private security badges stepped out of the vehicles, followed closely by a professional commercial moving crew. Julian backed away from the window, his face completely drained of color. "What is happening?" he choked out, looking frantically around the room. "Who are those people?" "Those people are the new property owners," Julian and I explained, walking over to the heavy mahogany front door and pulling it wide open. "As I mentioned, the developer bought this property specifically for commercial use. The moment the deed transferred yesterday morning, the zoning officially flipped. This is no longer a residential home. It is a commercial demolition site. And under state law, a residential lease is instantly null and void on an active commercial demolition site. You have absolutely zero tenant rights here." The head of the private security detail walked up the stone pathway, his boots crunching loudly. He was a massive man with a stern, uncompromising expression. He stepped into the grand foyer, completely ignoring Julian and Loretta. He looked directly at me and gave a polite, respectful nod. "Good morning, Ms. Davis," the security chief said, his deep voice filling the hallway. "The perimeter is secure and the transfer of possession is officially complete. Are these the unauthorized individuals you mentioned?" "Yes, they are," I replied, gesturing smoothly toward Julian and his mother. "They were just leaving." The security chief turned his attention to Julian. The professional courtesy vanished instantly, replaced by cold corporate authority. "Listen to me very carefully," the chief ordered, taking a step forward that forced Julian to retreat back into the kitchen. "This property is now owned by Apex Commercial Developments. As of this exact moment, you are trespassing on an active hazardous work site. You have exactly 15 minutes to gather your personal belongings and vacate the premises. If you are still standing inside this structure when my timer goes off, my men will physically drag you to the curb, and we will have the local police arrest you for commercial trespassing." 15 minutes! Julian screamed, his voice cracking in sheer panic. "We have an entire house full of things. My mother's bags are all upstairs. We cannot move everything in 15 minutes. The security chief reached up and tapped the heavy digital watch on his wrist. "You now have 14 minutes, he stated coldly. "My commercial movers will clear out whatever you leave behind and throw it directly into the industrial dumpsters out back. I suggest you start running." The illusion of power finally broke. The absolute reality of their situation crashed down on them like a tidal wave. Julian let out a loud, pathetic shout of frustration and sprinted up the glass staircase, taking the steps 2 at a time. Loretta shrieked, struggling to stand up straight. She ripped off my expensive silk robe, throwing it onto the floor, and scrambled toward the stairs, her bad knees suddenly working perfectly fine under the threat of impending arrest. I stood by the front door, watching the glorious chaos unfold. For the next 14 minutes, the house sounded like a sinking ship. Heavy footsteps pounded across the upstairs floors. I heard the distinct sound of cheap plastic luggage wheels violently slamming against the wooden stairs as Julian frantically dragged his mother's knockoff bags down to the foyer. He was sweating heavily, panting for breath, his designer shirt completely ruined. He did not look like a proud man anymore. He looked like exactly what he was, which was a parasite being forcefully extracted from its host. The professional movers marched in right past Julian and began dismantling my expensive custom furniture, wrapping it in heavy protective blankets to be shipped to my new luxury condominium downtown. Julian and Loretta were forced to dodge around the massive workers, grabbing armfuls of clothes and haphazardly tossing them out the front door onto the driveway. "Time is up," the security chief bellowed, his voice echoing over the noise. "Everyone not wearing a hard hat, get out right now." Julian grabbed his mother by the arm, practically dragging her out the front door. They stumbled down the stone pathway, looking completely disheveled and utterly defeated. I stepped out onto the front porch, breathing in the crisp morning air. I watched as the private security team unrolled thick metal chain-link fencing, dragging it right across the driveway, sealing the property off from the outside world. The sweet, satisfying taste of absolute victory was finally mine. The heavy metal gates of the temporary chain-link fence clanged shut with a loud, defining rattle, locking Julian, Loretta, and Keisha entirely out of the property they had spent months plotting to steal. I walked slowly down the driveway, my stilettos clicking sharply against the pavement, and slipped through the pedestrian gap just before the security guards secured the heavy steel padlock. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment, taking in the absolute masterpiece of their public humiliation. The morning sun was shining brightly, illuminating the full extent of their disgrace. Because Loretta had frantically ripped off my silk robe in the foyer, she was now standing on the public street in her cheap, faded floral pajamas, shivering slightly in the morning breeze. Julian was beside her, his expensive designer shirt completely soaked in sweat and covered in dust from the chaotic extraction. Keisha, who had been escorted out earlier, was pacing furiously back and forth across the concrete, still aggressively tapping her smartphone screen and screaming at an automated banking system that refused to unlock her frozen funds. They were surrounded by a pathetic barricade of 15 knockoff designer suitcases, hastily stuffed trash bags, and loose piles of clothing that had been tossed onto the curb. They looked exactly like a family of squatters who had finally run out of luck. The spectacle had drawn quite a crowd. My neighborhood was an exclusive, quiet community where people paid a premium for privacy. Now 6 of my affluent neighbors were standing on their porches or pausing their morning jogs to watch the chaotic reality show unfolding on my curb. I saw Mrs. Higgins from next door holding her coffee mug and openly staring at Loretta. Julian noticed the audience and immediately hunched his shoulders, trying to hide his face. The man who cared so deeply about projecting wealth and status to the world was now sitting on a plastic suitcase in the dirt, publicly exposed as a fraud. Julian pulled out his phone, his hands shaking violently as he scrolled through his contacts. He put the phone to his ear, pacing a few tight steps. I could hear the automated voicemail greeting picking up immediately. He tried another number and then another. Nobody was answering. Word of his catastrophic betrayal at the rehearsal dinner had already spread through our mutual friend group like wildfire. He had no money, he had no leverage, and he had absolutely no allies left. Loretta let out a loud, dramatic wail, finally letting her legs give out. She sank down onto a heavily scuffed faux leather bag, burying her face in her hands. "What are we going to do, Julian?" she sobbed, her voice muffled by her fingers. "Where are we supposed to sleep tonight? We do not have any money." Julian snapped, turning his rage onto the woman he had just thrown under the bus to federal agents. "Shut up, Mom," Julian hissed, his eyes darting frantically toward the security guard standing on the other side of the fence. "Just shut up and let me think. This is your fault anyway. If you had not pushed me to file that fake lease, we would not be sitting on the street." Keisha stopped her frantic pacing and rounded on both of them. "My husband is in federal custody because of you two," she screamed, pointing an acrylic nail directly at Julian's face. "We are going to lose our house. I am going to lose everything because you are a weak, pathetic man who could not even properly scam his own fiancée." I watched them tear each other apart with a profound sense of peace. There was no love in that family. There was only mutual parasitism, and the moment the host cut them off, they immediately began feeding on each other. I pressed the unlock button on my key fob, and my luxury sedan chirped softly from its parking spot down the street. I walked past them without saying a single word. I did not need to gloat or throw any final insults. The roaring sound of the massive yellow excavator firing up its hydraulic arm was the only parting message I needed to leave. As I opened my car door, the heavy steel bucket of the demolition machine swung forward and smashed directly into the master bedroom balcony, ripping the expensive wood and glass to absolute shreds. Loretta screamed, covering her ears, while Julian just stared blankly at the destruction of his unearned kingdom. I slid into the soft, leather driver's seat, put the car in drive, and pulled away from the curb, never looking in the rearview mirror. 10 hours later, the chaotic noise of the demolition site was entirely replaced by the soft, luxurious hum of a commercial jet engine. I was sitting in the spacious window seat of the first-class cabin, draped in a plush cashmere blanket. The cabin was dimly lit, bathed in a calm, ambient blue glow. I stretched my legs out fully in the reclining pod, relishing the absolute physical and mental freedom. When I canceled the wedding, I lost almost $80,000 in non-refundable vendor deposits. But there was one massive expense I deliberately chose not to cancel: the honeymoon. I had paid $25,000 for a 2-week stay in a private overwater bungalow in the Maldives. It was supposed to be a romantic getaway to celebrate the start of my new life as a wife. Instead, it was serving as the ultimate victory lap for a woman who had just successfully amputated a massive financial and emotional liability from her life. A flight attendant wearing a crisp, tailored uniform paused quietly beside my seat. She held a silver tray carrying a crystal flute filled with golden, bubbling liquid. "Vintage champagne for you, Ms. Davis," the flight attendant whispered, offering a warm, polite smile. "Congratulations on your trip. Are we celebrating a special occasion tonight?" I reached out and took the cold crystal glass, feeling the delicate bubbles popping against the rim. "I am celebrating a highly successful corporate merger," I replied smoothly, "and a very profitable asset liquidation." The flight attendant smiled politely, clearly not understanding the full context, but recognizing the absolute satisfaction in my voice. She nodded gracefully and continued down the aisle. I took a slow sip of the champagne. The crisp, expensive taste danced across my palate. I looked out the small, oval window, watching the glittering city lights of the skyline shrink into tiny, glowing dots as the massive aircraft banked heavily over the ocean. Down there in that sprawling city, Todd was sitting in a federal holding cell, waiting for an arraignment he could not afford. Keisha was likely sitting in her dark house, ignoring calls from aggressive debt collectors. And Julian and Loretta were probably huddled in a cheap motel room, frantically trying to figure out how to survive without my bank accounts masking their incompetence. I had spent 2 years ignoring my own intuition because I wanted the fairy tale. I had allowed society to convince me that a successful Black woman needed to shrink her accomplishments and carry the dead weight of a man just to prove she was capable of being loved. I had almost signed away my peace of mind, my hard-earned assets, and my entire future to a family that viewed me as nothing more than an automated teller machine. But sitting in that first-class cabin, 30,000 feet in the air, I realized I had not lost anything of actual value. I had gained absolute clarity. I had protected my empire. The grief I expected to feel over a canceled wedding was entirely absent, replaced by the intoxicating thrill of total liberation. I rested my head back against the soft leather headrest and took another sip of my champagne, letting the quiet luxury of the moment completely wash over me. I smiled as the plane leveled out, soaring smoothly toward paradise. They say behind every successful Black woman is a family trying to spend her money. Let them try. Let them. Just make sure you own the bank. The greatest lesson I learned from this entire ordeal is that your financial success and independence should never be minimized to make insecure people comfortable. Toxic individuals will often weaponize the concept of family loyalty to exploit your hard work, expecting you to sacrifice your peace for their convenience. Never let anyone guilt you into shrinking your boundaries or compromising your assets under the guise of love or tradition. True partnership is built on mutual respect and equal contribution, not entitlement. When people show you their true intentions, believe them immediately, gather your receipts, and fiercely protect your empire. If you have ever had to walk away from a toxic situation to protect your peace, please share your experience in the comments below and hit subscribe to join our community of strong, independent individuals.